Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to look more closely at color, but not in the way we usually talk about it in miniature painting or modeling, and not in the way color theory often gets reduced to technique, recipes, or rules. I'm not talking about how to mix a shadow color or how to push something warmer or cooler so it reads correctly. What I want to explore instead is how color operates underneath all of that as something psychological, cultural, and deeply personal, often long before we ever sit down at the bench. Most of us have had the experience of reacting to a color without being able to explain why. A color feels familiar, or heavy, or comforting, or maybe faintly unsettling, and we register that reaction immediately before we have language for it. We sense that a color belongs in a scene or that it does not, even when we can't point to a technical reason. Those reactions are not random, and they are rarely just aesthetic preferences. They're shaped by memory, by culture, and by experience, and they often tell us more about ourselves than about the color itself. Color becomes a kind of secret language we all speak without realizing we learned it. What I want to work through in this episode is the idea that pigment is not just visual material. It's memory made visible. It carries emotional weight, cultural history, and personal associations that we bring with us, whether we intend to or not. And when we work at miniature scale, where every choice is compressed and intensified, those associations become especially powerful. One of the most persistent ideas about color is that certain hues automatically cause certain emotions, as if the reaction were universal and hardwired into human biology. Red equals anger or excitement. Blue equals calm. Yellow equals happiness. These ideas are appealing because they're simple, but they do not hold up once you look closely at how people actually experience color in real situations. What research consistently shows instead is that color works indirectly. Color shapes attention. It influences arousal. It affects how alert, calm, tense, or engaged the body becomes at the moment something is happening. When attention and arousal increase, whatever is happening in that moment is more likely to be encoded strongly into memory. In that sense, color becomes part of the experience itself, not just a surface quality layered on afterward. This is why context matters so much. The same color can feel completely different depending on where it appears and what is happening around it. Red on a warning sign does not feel the same as red on a child's toy. White in a hospital does not feel the same as white in fresh snow. The color itself has not changed. What has changed is the framework the brain associates with it. Over time, those associations become shortcuts. When you encounter a color later, your body reacts before you consciously think about it, because the color has already been bound to previous experiences. That reaction can feel immediate, instinctive, even though it's learned. This is one reason disagreements about color can be so persistent. Two people can look at the same color and have very different reactions, not because one of them is wrong, but because the color is carrying different histories for each of them. And that's exactly where the tidy color charts start to fall apart. There's another layer to this that's easy to miss if we think of color as something we simply receive from the world. In everyday perception, the brain is constantly correcting color for changes in lighting. A white wall stays white across morning light, lamplight, or winter shade, even though the actual wavelengths reaching the eye have changed. That stability is useful, but it also means color is never just what's there. It's partly what the brain expects to be true. That expectation becomes even stronger with familiar objects. Most people carry what researchers call memory colors, a kind of internal default for how certain things are supposed to look. Bananas lean towards yellow, grass, green. Skin has a range, but it still carries an idea of normal. When the observed color drifts, the mind often pulls it back towards what it expects to be believable. This matters because it shows that color perception is already interpretive before emotion ever enters the picture. We are not responding to pigment alone. We are responding to a comparison between what we see and what we expect to be there. And real life is exactly where those charts struggle. One of the reasons simplified color emotion charts remain so popular is that they promise certainty. They suggest that color operates like a code, where a specific hue reliably triggers a specific feeling, regardless of who is looking or what else is happening. This way of thinking shows up in marketing manuals, design guidelines, and even some psychology textbooks, usually in the form of neat tables or diagrams. The problem is not that these frameworks are wrong, it's that they mistake statistical tendencies for lived experience. When researchers aggregate emotional ratings across large groups, patterns do emerge. Certain colors tend to be rated as more arousing, others tend to be rated as calmer or heavier, but these ratings are shallow measurements. They capture first impressions in controlled settings, not how color functions inside memory, culture, or personal history. What gets lost in universal theories is duration. Color rarely acts alone or briefly in real life. We do not encounter it in isolation. We live inside it over time as part of rooms, seasons, institutions, and routines. Meaning accumulates not because a color triggers a feeling once, but because it accomplishes a feeling repeatedly. Not what does red feel like, but what does this red feel like here, now, to this person? One reason those differences endure is that color doesn't stop at perception. It continues through language. One way to understand how powerful color can be is to think of it as a second channel of meaning running alongside language. We often assume that words carry meaning and color merely decorates language. But research on language and perception suggests the relationship runs both ways. Different languages divide the color spectrum differently, especially in regions like blue and green. Those divisions affect how reliably people distinguish shades, how easily they remember them, and how likely they are to talk about them as meaningful categories. Over time, those linguistic habits shape perception itself. The language of emotion often piggybacks on these color categories. Phrases like feeling blue or seeing red feel natural to English speakers, but they are not universal. Other languages use different metaphors or none at all. This means that part of what makes a color feel emotional is not the color itself, but the way a culture has taught people to talk about it. This is important because it reminds us that color meaning is not just sensory. It carries shared meaning. It's learned through repetition, reinforced through speech, and stabilized through shared usage. When we respond emotionally to a color, we are often responding to a whole system of meaning that has been layered over time. But language is not the only system doing this work. There's another way to think about color that does not focus on emotion at all, but on efficiency. From this perspective, color functions as a way the brain saves effort. It helps the brain sort, prioritize, and navigate complex visual environments quickly without conscious deliberation. In this view, color becomes meaningful not because it carries feeling, but because it helps manage attention. High contrast or saturated colors pull the eye. Low contrast or muted colors recede. Over time, emotional associations may attach themselves to these attentional patterns, but the original function is pragmatic rather than expressive. This framework helps explain why color plays such a strong role in systems like signage, uniforms, and diagrams. It also helps explain why color can feel emotionally charged even when nothing explicitly emotional is happening. The brain is reacting to shifts in attention and effort, not to symbolism. What's useful about this perspective is that it does not contradict the memory-based view. Instead, it complements it. Attention is the gateway to memory. Colors that consistently demand attention are more likely to become bound to whatever experience follows. Emotion is not replaced in this model, it's just downstream. At the same time, it would be misleading to say that color meaning is entirely arbitrary. Large cross-cultural studies show that people across many societies tend to agree on certain broad dimensions. Dark, low-saturation colors tend to be rated as heavier or more negative. Saturated colors tend to be more stimulating. Red tends to be high impact. Gray tends to recede. What varies dramatically is the story attached to those dimensions. A color that feels powerful in one culture may feel sacred in another, or forbidden or celebratory. Life cycle events like birth, marriage, and mourning often reverse color meanings entirely from one society to another. This is a useful distinction because it allows us to hold two ideas at once. There are shared perceptual tendencies, and there are culturally specific narratives layered on top of them. Color is neither biologically fixed nor endlessly malleable. It sits somewhere in between. Another common argument is that color meaning can be inferred from preference. If people like a color, it must feel positive. If they dislike it, it must feel negative. That assumption shows up frequently in surveys and design research, where preference rankings are treated as proxies for emotional meaning. People often dislike colors that carry strong emotional associations, especially ones tied to discomfort, authority, or loss. A color can feel significant without feeling pleasant. Conversely, a color can be pleasant without feeling meaningful. Preference measures tell us something about taste, but very little about memory or emotional depth. This distinction matters because some of the most powerful color associations are not ones we would choose voluntarily. Institutional colors, for example, often become emotionally charged precisely because they are imposed. The muted greens, beiges, and blues of bureaucratic spaces rarely top preference lists, yet they can carry intense emotional weight because of what happened in those environments. Color meaning is therefore not revealed by asking what people like, it's revealed by looking at where color appears repeatedly during emotionally salient experiences, whether or not those experiences are chosen. Color is deeply entangled with memory, particularly autobiographical memory. Memory is not stored as a list of facts. It's stored as reconstructed experience made up of sensory detail, emotional tone, and context. Visual cues play a powerful role in this process, especially when they were present during emotionally meaningful moments. When a color heightens attention or emotional arousal during an experience, it becomes part of the context the brain saves. Later, encountering that color again can reactivate the entire network associated with it. This is why certain colors feel like childhood, not in a symbolic sense, but in a very literal one. Childhood often seems to have a palette because early experiences are frequently surrounded by consistent colors. Toys, school supplies, packaging, interiors, institutional spaces. Those colors become woven into what safety, boredom, excitement, or embarrassment felt like at the time. They are not abstract colors, they're specific, situated, and personal. One of the cleanest demonstrations of this process comes from research on grapheme, and that's color synesthesia. In some people, letters or numbers are experienced as having fixed colors. What makes this research especially interesting is that many of these color associations can be traced back to specific childhood learning materials such as alphabet magnets or colored blocks. In well-documented cases, adults report letter-color pairings that precisely match the color of toys they used decades earlier. These associations are stable over time and resistant to change. Most people are not synesthetic, but the mechanism is revealing. Repeated color-object pairings during development can leave remarkably durable traces. This supports a more general claim that is much less exotic. Childhood color environments do not simply fade away. They become part of the perceptual scaffolding we carry into adulthood, influencing how we respond to color long after we stop thinking about where those responses came from. Color also functions as a way we mark time. Entire periods of our lives become associated with particular palettes, often without conscious intention. We can sometimes recognize a decade or a personal era from color alone, even when the objects themselves are similar. This is not nostalgia in the sentimental sense, it's perceptual timekeeping. Color helps us distinguish one phase of life from another because it was part of the environment that structured our experience of that time. Seasons play a role here as well. Many people carry internal color schemas for seasons that get mapped into life events. A certain palette feels like late summer, another feels like early winter. Over time, those seasonal associations blend with personal timelines, so a color can come to stand in for a specific year or a specific period of transition. This is one reason miniature scenes can feel anchored in time even when they're fictional. A palette alone can make a space read as a particular age, a particular decade, or a particular emotional season. This sense of time carried by color becomes especially noticeable when scale is reduced. Grief offers another important window into how color operates emotionally, because it shows how ordinary and unglamorous this process can be. Culturally, we have formal mourning colors that help structure loss and communicate it socially. But personal grief often attaches itself to much more mundane colors. Research on emotional memory shows that intense experiences are more likely to be stored with strong contextual detail. Color, when it's part of that context, can become a durable, retrievable cue. This is why grief colors are often not dramatic or symbolic, but painfully specific and ordinary. The beige of a hallway, the pale blue of early morning light, the washed-out green of a waiting room. Grief also affects color unevenly. Some colors become contaminated by loss and feel unusable afterward. Others become protected and narrowly defined. A specific shade may be preserved as a way of maintaining connection. This narrowing of palette is common in grief, and it reflects how tightly color can bind emotion and memory together. Up to this point, it might be tempting to think of color as something abstract, something that exists primarily in perception. Pigment complicates that idea because pigment is material. It has origin, cost, labor, and history. Historically, pigments were not equally available. Some were rare, difficult to produce, or geographically restricted, and those constraints shaped how they were used and what they came to signify. Certain colors became associated with authority or sanctity precisely because access to them was limited. These histories do not disappear simply because pigments are now commercially available. They continue to shape unspoken rules about which colors seem serious, legitimate, or excessive. Color becomes a system of legitimacy and taboo. When color becomes controversial, it is rarely because of optics alone. It is usually because color choices get entangled with judgments about seriousness, restraint, and credibility. Brightness becomes excess, saturation becomes immaturity, muted palettes become discipline. These are not neutral assessments, they are moralized taste judgments. In many art and design contexts, color restraint is treated as evidence of sophistication. This has very little to do with how the world actually looks and a great deal to do with cultural norms about self-control, professionalism, and legitimacy. Color becomes a way of signaling who belongs and who does not. This is one reason debates about color can become so heated. They are rarely just about aesthetics. They are about permission, who is allowed to use color freely, who is expected to restrain it, who gets read as serious, and who gets dismissed. Once you notice this pattern, it becomes harder to treat color criticism as purely technical. Color is carrying social meaning, whether we acknowledge it or not. If you want a single color where that social meaning gets impossible to ignore, pink is a good place to look. Pink offers a clear example of how color is pulled into systems of power, not because of what it inherently means, because of what institutions want it to do. One of the starkest historical uses appears in Nazi Germany, where color functioned as an administrative tool rather than an expressive one. In the concentration camp system, prisoners were forced to wear colored triangular badges that reduced identity to category at a glance. The pink triangle marked men imprisoned under paragraph 175, the law criminalizing male homosexuality. Here, pink did not operate symbolically in any modern psychological sense. It operated bureaucratically. The color was legible, repeatable, and enforceable. Through repetition and violence, it became bound to stigma and vulnerability. That meaning did not arise from preference or emotion. It arose from domination and from coercion. Decades later, a very different institutional use of pink emerged. In the late 1970s, a specific shade, often called Baker-Miller pink, was promoted as a way to reduce aggression in holding cells and other controlled environments. The claim was that brief exposure could dampen hostile behavior. The evidence for strong or lasting effects was mixed, and later studies found inconsistent results. What matters more than whether the color reliably worked is why institutions were drawn to the idea. Pink promised regulation without confrontation. It suggested that behavior could be shaped quietly through environment rather than force. Taken together, these examples show how readily color is asked to carry social responsibility. Meaning is projected onto it, repeated, and then treated as if it were intrinsic. Pink becomes associated with deviance. Pink becomes calming. Pink becomes manageable, not because the pigment changes, but because power teaches people how to read it. This is the point where color stops being neutral and starts to function as judgment. This shows up clearly in conversations about realism, especially in miniature work. Certain palettes are treated as inherently legitimate or accurate, while others are dismissed as toy-like or unserious. But realism is not purely optical, it's cultural. It reflects what viewers have been trained to accept as believable. Desaturated palettes often read as serious or mature. Bright, high chroma palettes are often associated with childhood, fantasy, or lack of seriousness. These associations are not neutral. They are value judgments shaped by habit and culture, not objective truths about how the world looks. Once you recognize this, arguments about realism start to look different. They often mask deeper assumptions about which emotional registers are considered legitimate and which are not. At miniature scale, disagreements about color can intensify because compression removes ambiguity. There is less room for the eye to wander, less visual noise to dilute impact. Color decisions become immediately legible and therefore immediately interpretable. This compression means that color carries more responsibility. It establishes mood faster, it signals intent more clearly, It leaves less space for viewers to project their own assumptions without confronting the maker's choices. As a result, miniature color choices often feel more confrontational than full-scale ones, even when they're not meant to be. The scale amplifies meaning and with it judgment. This is not a flaw of miniature work, it's one of its defining strengths. But it does mean that color in miniatures will always be read as deliberate, whether or not it was consciously theorized or not. This matters in miniature work because miniatures compress everything. At small scale, color establishes atmosphere so quickly and decisively. It shapes attention, emotional salience, and how close the viewer feels to the scene. The viewer's eye anchors very quickly, often on color before form. A single saturated accent can become the psychological center of an entire vignette. Warm palettes can invite prolonged looking. Cooler or more constrained palettes can create distance. Because miniatures compress space and narrative, color functions almost like compressed memory as well. It delivers emotional information efficiently, allowing the viewer's mind to reconstruct a world that feels complete, intimate, and unsettled with very little visual data. This is why miniature scenes can feel strangely personal, even when they depict anonymous or fictional spaces. Color does a lot of the interpretive work. So when we look at color through the shrink ray, what we're really seeing is accumulation. Color gathers meaning over time through experience, culture, and history. It becomes shorthand for things we may not consciously articulate. When you choose a color, you are often not just choosing appearance, you're choosing which associations, memories, and expectations are invited into the work. That does not mean every choice needs to be overthought, but it does mean color deserves attention as more than decoration. In miniature work especially, where scale amplifies meaning, color becomes one of the primary ways we communicate memory, emotion, and identity, whether we intend to or not. So if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist. Subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here. I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.